All right. Good afternoon. It's 12 o'clock Central Time. It's Wednesday. That means it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, and glad to be back hosting in this capacity rather than our dialogue like last week. Although that was a lot of fun, but I don't want to have to do it every week. So thanks again to Mark Licht for participating. For those that weren't on, we had a dialogue about cover crops with Mark Licht. No PowerPoints, just a discussion, and we're going to continue that in March and April with Dr. Allison Robertson and Dr. Wesley Everman talking kind of again beyond the basics of cover crops. While many of you might be interested in cover crops, that's not why we're here today. We're going to hear today from Dr. Isaac Larsen. Dr. Larsen is an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he's going to talk about the present, past, and future of soil erosion in the Midwestern U.S. And I think for many of us here in the Midwest, we view our soil resource is one of the most vital natural resources we're lucky enough to have, and we have some of the best soils in the world. But it's really important that we think about soil erosion and I would say trying to minimize that so we prolong that productivity value of the soils that we're so fortunate to have here. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Larsen. As always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Dr. Larsen at the end of his talk. With that, the virtual floor is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for everyone tuning in. I'm just gonna start with just a little bit of a question about why should we care about soil erosion? And the most basic answer is that it's because food comes from soil. About 95% of the soil consumed worldwide is grown in soil, and soils that have been degraded by erosion produce less food. You can see in this is a figure showing data from plots throughout Iowa, a study from out of Iowa State, showing how corn yields decline as the thickness of the A horizon, or colloquially the topsoil, that organic carbon-rich upper soil layer, as that thickness declines due to erosion. We see yields decline, and these are yield data from the 80s, so they're not maybe what we expect today. But there's about a 20% reduction if nitrogen fertilizer is used to replace soil function. Without that fertilizer, it's much more drastic on the order of 80%. And we're also at a time where global population is increasing exponentially, and it's been estimated that crop production is going to have to double in the next 25 years or so. And because soil has been widely degraded, its function has been in many landscapes replaced with synthetic fertilizers, which of course have downsides of impairing water quality. Here we can see values of nitrate in groundwater, and the map is orange and red is where much of the Corn Belt is, which is no coincidence. And then all of this ends up in our rivers and heading down to the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a dead zone is produced annually. And it's not just in sort of a water quality or environmental problem. It becomes a human health issue. Iowa is sort of ranked second in the nation in terms of incidence of cancer, and that's been linked to issues with water. And on perhaps a more sort of hopeful note, worldwide soils contain about 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere, and there's a lot of interest in keeping the carbon that is in soil there, and also coming up with solutions for increasing carbon stocks in soil, with which not only benefits our current climate state, but has the co-benefit of helping agricultural productivity. And I focus on the Midwest because I'm a Midwesterner, but also because it's one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the world. I'm sure this isn't news to anyone tuning in, but you know, most of the corn and soybean yield in the U.S. comes from the Midwest. Um, but agricultural productivity comes with erosion. So we see one map that's just showing corn production within the region, and the sort of hotspot of corn production aligns very closely with the hotspot of soil erosion as predicted by the USDA. And we've known that soil erosion has been a problem since the 1930s when the Dust Bowl started bringing attention to this problem at a national level. But we have a poor understanding of the current rates of soil erosion, and the magnitude has been debated. If we want to go back in time and understand how erosion rates have changed in the past, we have an even poorer understanding. But there have been new tools that have come online in the last few decades to better address these problems, and that's how I'm going to spend the rest of this talk. And I'm going to try to cover three questions about the present, past, and future. What's the current extent of soil erosion in the Midwest? At what rate has agriculture eroded soils, and how do those rates occur with pre-farming values? And thinking about the future, how potentially could erosion of soil and the organic carbon associated with it change as landscapes evolve under different farming and land use scenarios? And so I'm going to start with a satellite image from an area about 8 miles south of Clear Lake, Iowa. Hope you can see my mouse. This is the house that I grew up in, and the road that's running east-west across this image is a road I've driven down 1,000 times in my life. But I didn't really understand the soil patterns in this landscape until I started looking at it from space. And what you can see is that there are areas of very light colored soils. And they're always associated with the tops of hills or ridges, the sort of convex parts of the landscape. And then there are areas of dark colored soils, and those are all the topographic lows, the low ground of the landscape. And we started looking at other places, and it turned out everywhere we looked, we saw the same thing. We looked in Minnesota, and again, we can see this pattern of the very light colored soils on the hilltops. We see this in South Dakota. We see this in Illinois. We see this in Nebraska, where we have very different types of soil than those other examples. And it turns out that what we're seeing those landscapes, and this has been documented by researchers at Iowa State and the USDA in Minnesota, that those light colored soils are areas where the A horizon, or the topsoil, has been completely eroded from the landscape, and what we're seeing is the B horizon, or the subsoil, that's now exposed on the land surface. And we know that these areas used to have rich, dark soil at the ground surface, because when we go to native prairies throughout the Midwest and collect soil probe samples, we see that dark, rich topsoil on the hilltops. And so I'm not going to go into the details, but we combined a bunch of field and laboratory analyses of thousands of soils that were collected by the USDA to come up with an index for differentiating between the A horizon and the B horizon in satellite images. And this is just an example again. The only thing special about this place is this is the house that I grew up in. And this image has this interesting circle in it. And so if you can't come up with any questions to ask at the end, you can ask about this circle. But the first thing we do is we apply our method to a high resolution satellite image, and we create this index of soil organic carbon here with the areas in brown and tan, indicating areas of low carbon, and in the sort of purple colors are high carbon. And then we apply our threshold to differentiate the parts of the image that are the A versus the B horizon. And that's shown by the black outlines on this image. And then we also assess our uncertainty in those estimates, which are shown by those green and white outlines. And then we calculate the percentage of the field that has completely lost the A horizon due to erosion. And in this particular case, it's 47%, plus or minus about 10% of the field no longer has an A horizon at the soil surface. And what we find is that there's a very strong topographic control. And so we use very high resolution digital topographic data from LiDAR to calculate different topographic metrics. And one we use is called curvature, which is just showing that, in this image, areas in red are highlighting those areas that have convex topography. Areas in blue are areas with concave topography. And then if there are straight slopes, they're shown in the sort of yellowish color. And what we see is that for the most convex parts of the landscape, or the sort of most pointy hills, all of the pixels have exposed B horizon at the surface. And then that fraction declines as the parts of the landscape are less convex, reaches a minimum value that's associated with our sort of flattish depositional areas in the landscape, and then it increases again for those areas just off the shoulders of the hill slope where things turn convex, but there's still been a fair bit of soil loss. And we did this for many sites throughout the region, over hundreds of square miles. And when we sort of sum this up and also extrapolate to areas where we don't have images using the high resolution LiDAR data, our estimate is that about 35% of the Corn Belt region no longer has an A horizon soil. And that's a big contrast to what the soil survey would estimate, which is essentially 0%. And then we did some estimates about just what does that mean, and it's about a 6% decline in crop yields annually across the region, leading to about a 3 billion in annual losses for farmers. For Iowa, we estimate about 800 million. And that doesn't include things like the cost of fertilizer to enhance production in those areas. It's just the loss of yield. And for an average size farm, it comes out to be on the order of tens of thousands of dollars per year. So real money, I would say. And so the question is, what's driving these patterns that we see? And it's tillage or plowing. Tillage causes the downslope transport of soil, and because it's mechanized and there's a lot of energy going into it, it's moving soil 100 to 1,000 times faster than natural processes. And the transport of soil is greater as the convexity of a hill slope increases. And so we can essentially think about it as repeated plowing has essentially pushed soil off of the hilltops, and that's why we no longer have an A horizon. And I think it's worth pointing out that in the U.S. Our national assessments include assessing soil erosion by water, including the effect of tillage in enhancing erosion by water, but don't account for the actual movement of soil by tillage itself. And so this analysis has sort of told us this is sort of where we are in terms of the amount of erosion in the U.S., but it doesn't tell us about what the rates of erosion are, or how those compare to rates that soils form. And that's where we go to the past. Um, and This is an example from Stinson Prairie. It's a native prairie that's never been farmed in Kossuth County. And I'm here standing across the fence in the prairie, and this survey rod is stuck in the field next door. And we've gone out to this site and then other sites like it, and with a very high resolution GPS, we've surveyed the landscape to quantify how much soil has been eroded. And this particular example, 64 centimeters, so a couple feet of soil have been eroded along this boundary. And so we get that change of elevation from the centimeter scale GPS surveys that you probably see um, engineers going around with these things at construction sites. Look like they have a little UFO on the top of a pole. And then we can infer the time since cultivation began from land records, essentially when land changed hands from the federal government via the Louisiana Purchase into private individuals via the Homestead Act. And from those two pieces of information, we can infer an erosion rate, just the change in the elevation over time. And we've done this at about 20 sites from around the Midwest, mostly in Iowa, but also in surrounding states. And if we just sort of put all of those data together, this plot at the top is just showing the reduction in soil thickness that we measure across those boundaries, and our sort of central tendency is about 28 centimeters, so roughly a foot of soil has been eroded from those landscapes. And if we convert that to an erosion rate, it comes out to about 2 millimeters per year. And just to put that in perspective, part of my PhD dissertation was focused on erosion rates in the Himalaya, and where the Brahmaputra River flows out of the Himalaya. The upstream watershed is eroding at about 2 millimeters per year. And so we have sort of Himalaya scale erosion rates, but without all of the topography and active plate tectonics of the Himalaya. And in the US, all soil series are assigned a soil loss tolerance value, or a T value, that's supposed to delimit the maximum erosion rate that can be tolerated without loss of agricultural productivity. And for all of these soils, our T value is 5 tons per acre per year, which converts to about a millimeter per year. So our soils have, since the sort of start of agriculture, have been eroding roughly 10 tons per acre per year, or double the rate that has been deemed tolerable. We can go even farther into the past, and I won't get into the details here, but I run an ultra clean geochemistry lab for measuring very rare isotopes produced when high energy cosmic rays produced by supernova explosions out in the Milky Way collide with minerals and rock and soil at Earth's surface. And we go out to native prairies like this, and we collect samples along deep profiles and do a lot of work, and then send the samples off to be measured at these sort of warehouse-sized facilities. This one's at Purdue. And from that, we get information about what the rates of erosion are averaged over 1,000-year timescales, or rates essentially before agriculture. And we just look at some of the results. So the median pre-agricultural soil erosion rate is on the order of 0.04 millimeters per year, so very low. And I note that this is essentially equivalent to the rate that soil is produced from, in the case of Iowa, the underlying glacial till or loess. And so this value is very much lower than what's considered a tolerable amount of soil loss. And in this plot, I'm just showing the pre-agricultural erosion rate we get from this technique against the agricultural erosion rate that we measure using the technique I showed before at these same sites. And if these values were the same, all of the points would be aligning on this falling on this line that says 1x. They don't. They fall somewhere between this 10x line and 100x line, and even some up to 1,000, which is indicating that agricultural erosion rates are between 10 and more than 1,000 times greater than pre-agricultural erosion rates, and which is essentially telling us that soil is being eroded, 10 to 1,000 times faster than it forms. And so that's sort of where we are and how we got there in terms of erosion rates. And then we started thinking about the future, and we asked ourselves, can we accurately predict the patterns and the rates of soil erosion that we observed by these methods, with the idea that if we could generate such a predictive framework, that sort of model could provide some kind of insight into understanding the future of soils in the Midwest. And so we've gone to sites like this where we have an actively farmed field, and then adjacent to that where we have a native prairie, and we collect samples from that prairie, and we use those samples to reconstruct what the distribution of organic matter would have been, both as a function of topography and depth in this field prior to the start of erosion. And then we implement a rule for erosion by tillage. And we track the movement of soil between digital cells in our landscape. Just tracking the amount of soil into a cell and out of a cell, and if there's more leaving than coming in, we have net erosion, and we're also tracking the carbon. This is the example, just a model of showing how that simulation works, where we start with carbon-rich soils based on what we see in the prairie, and then those evolve over time, and we can see that things get more and more tan colored as carbon is lost. And if we look at just a cross section on a hill slope through that site, we see if this is our initial landscape, at the end we're predicting sort of loss of soil and the carbon associated with it on the hill slopes, and then the deposition in the hollows of the landscape. And what we find, this is just an example of a pattern we predict, and then the pattern we preserve in satellite imagery. And it's not perfect everywhere, but when we compare our predictions against our observations, we find that they're well correlated. And so we think this model at least has some utility for thinking about, if we looked at different scenarios, what would this mean sort of region-wide? And so the first scenario we addressed was just a hypothetical case where we started with a scenario where there was no use of no-till farming anywhere, and we compared that to a case where we used the present-day utilization of no-till farming on a sort of a countywide basis, shown on the upper right here, and just compared the amount of erosion from these two scenarios, again using different erosion rates assigned to areas with conventional tillage versus no-till farming. And what we find is that there's about a 50% difference in soil erosion and about a 40% difference in the movement of organic carbon associated with that soil. And so this is essentially telling us this is what no-till is doing now. It's reducing soil erosion by about 50% region-wide. And then we asked the question, well, what if no-till was adopted more widely and everywhere? And so what you can see here is this is now we're comparing the map of what we predict in terms of the pattern of erosion based on present day adoption of no-till versus complete adoption of no-till. And it's just, of course, a very stark difference. The map turns black because the erosion, in this case, we're looking at units of eroded carbon associated with the soil, drop dramatically. We estimate, erosion declines by 95%, and the movement of carbon associated with that by about 98%. And that sort of brings me to the answer to our three questions. What's the current extent of soil erosion in the Midwest? About a third of the landscape no longer has an A horizon. And when we got to this situation, because erosion has been happening at rates of about 2 millimeters per year, double what's assumed to be a tolerable amount of loss, but orders of magnitude greater than geological rates of soil erosion, which are equivalent to rates of soil formation. We predict that the more widespread adoption of no-till could greatly reduce the erosion of soil and carbon on the order of 95%. And then some of the sort of larger takeaways of this are that tillage is an important but overlooked contributor to soil degradation in the US. Soil loss tolerance values require revision if they are to be meaningful policy instruments, and they are used in developing farm conservation plans and in allocation of funds from the Farm Bill, for example. We think we have ways to guide the revision of those values. No-till farming is a potential solution, but policies and incentives are needed for wider adoption. And I'm also not saying it's the magic bullet for all of the issues. No-till alone often doesn't rebuild soil carbon. There are issues with the use of Roundup in terms of water quality in no-till systems. And then what we're working on now is that we're working on a time series of land enrolled in CRP, because most of the soil and the organic matter in it probably hasn't moved very far. Most of it's just gone from the top of the hills to the bottom, in filling the depressions in the prairie pothole region, and in other areas, it's probably still in the headwaters of the watersheds. And there's a lot of potential for essentially moving CO2 from the atmosphere into soils if we can put carbon back in those areas that were degraded. And so we're looking at that in terms of CRP to do that in sort of actively agriculture areas. It's where cover crops that I've mentioned earlier come in. And again, this is just sort of the direction we're moving in. But with that, I just want to thank all of you for tuning in. My former students and postdocs who worked on all this, and then at the bottom are all the folks who helped us find study sites and gave us permission to work on their land. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Isaac. That was great. We already have a number of questions, but if you have some others, please type in the chat box. We'll go through kind of the last logistical slide. So if you want to forward ahead, we really want to thank the key funding partners to the Iowa Learning Farms, and specifically for webinars, and that includes Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Iowa DNR, Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. We'll go to the next slide, which if you're on here and if you watch this live and you're wanting to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today, including your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. We'll go to the next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. Only one survey response is needed for all 2026 webinars. So if you've done that already, thank you very much. And if you're willing, we would greatly appreciate it. And we'll go next slide, which should be a plug for the webinar next week, which is we're still on sediment. So we're going to look at sediment storages, nutrient storage, and long-term sustainability of farm ponds in southern Iowa by colleagues at the University of Iowa, the Iowa Geological Survey in particular. And last slide. Uh, if if you watch this webinar and you want to go back to see anything, all the cool graphics that were great, the webinar is archived as long as the recording worked, and we're duplicating it. So hopefully it does. So iowalearningfarms.org/webinars or the YouTube channel there. So Dr. Larsen, we do have some questions here. I'll try to get through as many as we can, but what's the average elevation change of the convex versus concave hill slopes?
Um, Convex, from our surveys on the order of uh, 28 centimeters, or median, essentially our average, so about a foot. We we had fewer measurements in the convexities, but when we do measure it, some areas we see deposition of soil, and some areas we don't see very much change, and that could be because those areas that are where we have deposition, we're just transferring the soil from the top to the bottom. But it's also it's the tillage is moving soil from those high areas to areas farther down the slope where water erosion can come into play, and so it may be moving around via water.
Okay, one thing I forgot though. Tell us about that circle.
The circle.
Yeah,
Um, so the circle is an area where it's a drained prairie pothole
okay,
wetland, and it does occasionally flood in the spring. And so what we're looking at there is essentially a little shoreline of corn stalks that have been rafted
okay.
around the image. And you may wonder, well, Isaac, you haven't told us about the role of crop residue in influencing your analysis. And what we do is we've gone to areas where we have a satellite image and where the USDA has collected a sample, and so we can account for the influence of what's on the surface in our analyses. But everywhere we've looked, that's the only place we've actually seen one of those develop. Just
Okay.
happens to be right in my backyard.
Yeah. Any ideas on how we can help increase the understanding and importance of soil erosion?
Um, that's a great question. You could share the link to the
Okay.
archive with all of your friends. You know, so I try to, whenever I get an invitation like this, I always say yes. Our we're also a land grant university, and our press folks are always putting out things, press releases when one of our studies come out. Um, it would be great if it was a bigger part of the national conversation. Matt's comment earlier about soil being, what would Iowa be without soil, or the soil that it has, and it's completely different scenario, and I think soil the issue of soil erosion had a lot of attention in prior decades, and I think there's a sort of view that we've solved the problem. Um, but I would argue that we haven't, especially in areas where we still have conventional tillage.
Yeah. And I think your slide there of kind of, what's been the benefits of kind of reduced tillage and what could be the benefits going to no-till, is maybe a good news, bad news. I mean, yes, we've had these losses, but we have some tools that if they're more widely used could really help us.
Yes, we have tools. We know they work. they're not as widely adopted in north central Iowa. Just the soils are different than in the other parts of the state, but I have neighbors who farm with no-till. It's doable.
Yeah,
Um,
there was okay. There was somebody that asked if there's a source which can show the tan-colored images of our own farms, so they want to look at it locally.
um, yes,
Oh,
these images you can look at them in Google Earth or even Google Maps if you turn on uh, the um, the imagery button instead of
okay,
the streets. But that maps will usually just show one snapshot. But if you go to Google Earth and there's an online version, you can toggle through images from different times. For example, if you have to have an image from the non-growing season, um, when there's not snow, for example, to actually see your fields.
okay. Somebody brought up as they were curious how much of the difference in sea between hilltops and swales is due to erosion and how much may be due to differences in soil organic matter formation.
There are differences in those areas, even without any agricultural soil erosion. So you can imagine, even if you go out in a native prairie, it does have the A horizon, but it's not as thick as if you go to the swales, just because, at the top of a hill, water and soil that's moving under natural processes and nutrients are all diverging from those areas. Um, but in our sort of modeling exercise, we've sort of accounted for that in recreating the initial topography. So if you go out to prairies today, you will see differences, but those differences have been greatly exacerbated by soil erosion in agricultural fields.
Okay. Um, can you, while we continue with these questions, can you go back to the takeaway slide?
Yes.
And if this is any sign of the interest, this webinar will break the record for the most number of questions asked, which is awesome. But
Excellent.
I do apologize if we do run out of time at some point that we need to be um, respectful of Dr. Larsen's time, but
No, it's okay.
we'll keep going for a while. I just wanted to, I think that's really awesome. So, can you please explain how you're differentiating tillage erosion and water erosion, since these categories are typically understood as being interconnected?
Yes. As on they both happen. So I'm not trying to advocate that water erosion doesn't happen or wind erosion doesn't happen. But if you think about the very top of a hill, and it's raining, there's very little uphill source area for water to accumulate, generate enough force or stress to entrain soil particles, and move them. And so when we're looking at these images of these eroded hilltops, um, tillage is really the main process that can remove soil from them. Certainly in the images, we see the integrated effect of all types of erosion. Um, but the fact that we see the tan colored soil predominantly at the most convex and very tops of the hills is really indicating that tillage is a key factor in driving the erosion in those areas.
Is the basis for the A horizon loss based on soil color change observed from the aerial photos only?
It is, yes. So it's essentially our index uses color to differentiate between the A and B horizon, and we've done that based on those um, those USDA samples. They have measured, they're from soil pits, so they've defined the horizon that their samples come from, and also essentially shined a very bright light on all of those samples to measure reflectance in different wavelengths. And we can match some of those up with the wavelengths measured by the satellites. And so we have essentially a color metric from the lab data that tell us, well, that have already been determined whether the soil is A or B horizon. And then we go to the satellite image, and if we see a color that matches, I'm simplifying here, but the color that matches the A horizon, we classify it as A horizon. If we see a color that matches the B horizon, and these are from samples the USDA has collected locally to each of our sites, we classify it as B horizon.
There are kind of a couple interrelated questions here, kind of related. Somebody asked if you thought your topsoil techniques would work in the Southeast. And then somebody asked, is this observation a global trend in other parts of intensive ag regions?
I think so. Our sort of satellite or remote sensing method would work as long as there are color contrasts between the horizons. And then one reason we don't do this everywhere is we have to use fairly high resolution commercially available satellite imagery. So with pixels on the order of meters, because that's the scale at which we see changes in erosion as a function of topography. And so if it's cropping season, we obviously can't see the soil. If it's no-till, we can't see the soil. Um, if there's snow, we can't see the soil. But as long as there are areas where you can image the soil, I think this technique was work. I just gave a presentation on this at an international conference, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I've seen this even more pronounced in Spain, where there you've had erosion instead of 150, 160 years in the Midwest for thousands of years, and it's led to very high contrast in the soils, where essentially the ridge tops are essentially just the bedrock,
Mhm.
and then you have different colored material filling in the hollows of the landscape.
Okay. Um, this one kind of was asked, or somebody asked it before, and I hadn't gotten to it. But this, how have concert or ag conservation policymakers reacted to your findings, and have any offered any potential soil erosion control policies as a result of your findings?
Um, that so that's a good question. Uh, a reporter asked me once if anyone from the USDA had asked me about these results, and my answer to them was no. They hadn't. I've subsequently had some more recent conversations with folks with the USDA, um, uh, interacting more at um, the kind of county level. Um, but then that reporter was like, "Well, I think there's some people I'd like to talk to you with," and he got me in touch with some staffers of one of the senators on the Senate Ag Committee, and I gave a very similar presentation to what you heard today to them, and so it's making its way um, to some people. Of course, we're in a case now where we don't even have a farm bill, but when people ask me what would you recommend, I would say, well, let's let's not incentivize practices that we know are going to lead to erosion and degrade soil, but let's do things like instead, offset the cost of buying a no-till planter. I know these are not non-trivial costs and whatnot, but there are ways that we can use the sort of existing policy framework to, I think, uh, incentivize things that will make a difference.
Mhm.
Um, like many things involving politics, it's hard to get those messages out and up to everyone, but we'll just keep trying.
Yep. All right. Somebody asked actually, and somebody else pointed out, are you sure that ring area wasn't visited by aliens? There were a
Um,
couple space references in your talk, so yeah, yeah,
there are some space references.
yeah.
I don't have the
Yeah.
photos here, but I actually at a different time I was at home and I walked out there and
And you
had
saw it with your, you
pictures
used,
of the corn stalks, and so
okay,
I'm fairly convinced.
yeah, you used the observational method. So, um, okay, how do you account for moisture content effects on soil color?
Um, in in our particular case, we we do account for this. So for all of the analyses we did, we looked at the timing images were taken relative to the timing of precipitation to make sure things weren't taken right after rainfall. But essentially, water makes soils darker, and so if you have moist A horizon soil, they just keep looking like A horizon soil. If you have B horizon soil that's moist, it it could in some cases look like an A horizon soil. So in that case, our estimates would be sort of a minimum value if we had an effect of moisture. And so essentially it's something that we think about, but it nicely works out that if we're just worried about A versus B, uh, we don't have to worry about it so much. If we want to quantify percent carbon, then we have to be careful and think about the moisture content at the soil surface at the time that the images were taken.
Right. Um, I think you, I think you got most of them here. Yes, the somebody asked us if the Q&A portion of the presentation included in the recording. It absolutely is. So, and you did kind of talk there about kind of how you've been talking to folks about this that are interested from the policy standpoint. So I want to be respectful of your time, Dr. Larson. I want to thank you very much for the excellent presentation. As I said, I apologize if we didn't get to all the comments, but I think we got through many of them. And as I said, I think that'll break the record for the most questions we've gotten during the webinar. Again, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And please tune in next week to hear from Matthew Streeter and Calvin Walter about farm ponds in southern Iowa. With that, I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so very much for attending the Iowa Learning Farms webinar. If this is your first, please keep on the lookout for more in the future. And if you're a repeat person, repeat information, repeat viewer, um, thank you very much. And we'll work to get Dr. Larson's contact information in the chat box. Somebody asked for that. So we'll work on that. So thank you very much.